2014 was, in many ways, a year of transition, as in the world of pop culture, not only was Jimmy Fallon taking over Jay Leno as the host of The Tonight Show, but we also saw the Breaking Bad universe continue with Better Call Saul. And over in the world of wrestling, things were in just as much of a state of flux because with the Yes movement reaching new heights, we'd finally see the culmination of one of the all-time great storylines, all while a brand new crop of superstars were rising to the top. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWE in 2014, a year in review. When we last left off, Randy Orton had just beaten John Cena to become the undisputed WWE World Heavyweight Champion, CM Punk was undergoing severe burnout with the company, and Daniel Bryan was the most over person the wrestling industry had seen in a long time. That said, even if he was beloved by most watching, Vince McMahon just didn't see him as anything more than a B-plus player. So in order to stop some of his heat then, the boss had gone as far as to turn Bryan heel by having him align with the villainous Wyatt family. But plans would change yet again when, after reportedly seeing a crowd full of people doing the yes chant at a basketball game, Vince decided he needed the American Dragon as a babyface once more. And so that was why on the January 13th episode of Raw, the fan favorite turned face again when he got Bray Wyatt trapped inside of a cage, then proceeded to give him a beatdown, all to one of the loudest ovations in history. Of course, with things now as they should be, many began to wonder if this proved plans had indeed changed and Bryan was going to win the Royal Rumble after all. The only problem with this theory, though, was that in the weeks leading up to the Rumble, it was announced that Batista would be returning and that he had intentions of winning himself. And that led us into January 26th, where, in front of a packed Pittsburgh crowd, the night began with Daniel Bryan not only losing to the Eater of Worlds, but also getting kayfabe injured in the process too. That said, most fans felt they could see through this as they believed the injury was being done so their hero could make a dramatic return in the Rumble itself. Before we get there though, the rest of the undercard saw Brock Lesnar demolish the Big Show in preparation for his WrestleMania showdown with The Undertaker, and Randy Orton retain the WWE World Heavyweight title once more against John Cena. Then in the main event, anticipation was sky high as things started out with CM Punk entering at number 1. But while he was certainly still a fan favorite here, the real person most wanted to see win was the American Dragon. So much did they want this, in fact, that once Batista entered at number 28, he was roundly booed. This despite the fact he was a babyface. And that booing only got worse when Rey Mysterio came out at number 30 and it had become apparent to all that Daniel Bryan was not going to be involved. Yes, the fans now turned on the match itself, and so when Batista won at the end after last eliminating Rusev, the live crowd let him know just how unhappy they were about the result. And with CM Punk finally having reached his breaking point during the Rumble match, he'd show up backstage at Raw the next night and immediately go to meet with Vince McMahon and Triple H. And it was during the course of this meeting that he'd tell them he was going home and wouldn't be returning again. Of course, at the time, the boss thought it was just Punk being angry and that once he cooled off, he'd be back, but as it turned out, this was the end of the voice of the voiceless in WWE for a long time. So needless to say, this threw a lot of WrestleMania plans up in the air as Punk was supposed to have a big-time match there against The Game. But even if this had gone ahead as planned, it still wouldn't have fixed the problem of what to do about Daniel Bryan. Yes, at this time, plans were still for Batista versus Randy Orton at the Showcase of the Immortals instead. Of course, fans were so turned off by this prospect, though, that they booed Big Dave every time he came out to the ring, with this leading to his opponent at February 23rd's Elimination Chamber, Alberto Del Rio, actually getting cheered. But for as disappointed as people were with the main event scene, there was at least one big dream match they'd get to see that night as, in a 6-man tag, The Shield clashed with the Wyatt family in one of the most heated encounters we had seen in years. Yes, it was the rare example of a true dream match taking place in the modern age. And once it was done and people's mood had been lifted, the live crowd even allowed themselves to believe we might have Daniel Bryan win the WWE World Heavyweight title in the main event. But how was he going to do this? Well, by being part of the Elimination Chamber match, which also included John Cena, Cesaro, Christian, Sheamus, and champion Randy Orton. Sadly though, the Dragon did not come out of this the winner, as instead, Corporate Kane interfered and helped the Viper to retain come the end. And unfortunately for Batista, this was something which continued to haunt him over the weeks which followed, because with fans still not taking to him, the Animal was forced to turn heel. Meanwhile, down in NXT, the future was looking bright as on February 27th, they'd host their first ever network special, NXT Arrival, with a card that saw Paige retain the brand's women's title against Emma, Adrian Neville win the NXT World title from Bo Dallas, and Sami Zayn continue his losing streak with a loss to Cesaro. And this was the first show to ever air live on the newly launched WWE Network. Then, on the March 10th episode of Raw, we saw a segment where fans invaded the ring and demanded Daniel Bryan be inserted into the WrestleMania main event. Of course, with nothing else to do then, Triple H came out and announced that the American Dragon would get to make it a triple threat match between him, Randy Orton, and Batista, but only if he could beat the game first. And that led us directly into the biggest show of the year on April 6th, where the night after Scott Hall, Lita, Paul Bearer, Jake the Snake Roberts, and the Ultimate Warrior were inducted into the Hall of Fame, WrestleMania took place in New Orleans, where a rabid crowd hoped to see a miracle on Bourbon Street. Thankfully then, the night started off on the right foot as in the opener, after a historic in-ring meeting took place between Steve Austin, The Rock, and Hulk Hogan, Daniel Bryan defeated Triple H to book his spot in the main event. And following that, the exciting times continued when The Shield beat Attitude Era stars the New Age Outlaws and Kane, Cesaro won the first ever Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal, and in a shock to many fans, Bray Wyatt lost to John Cena. But this wasn't the biggest shocker of the night as it turned out, because following on from there, the unthinkable occurred when Brock Lesnar beat The Undertaker to end his near 2.5-decade-long undefeated WrestleMania streak. So needless to say, this left the crowd in stunned silence as they had come to terms with the fact that the dead man was mortal after all. And it left a tough task for the main event too, because despite Daniel Bryan being the man of the hour, it took about 15 minutes for him, Randy Orton, and Batista to get fans invested again during their triple threat match after they'd just seen the streak end. Luckily though, by the time the climax was approaching, the trio had the crowd in the palm of their hands once more. And when after 28 minutes and 20 seconds, the Animal tapped out to the babyface hero, the whole stadium erupted with cheers the likes of which hadn't been seen since Eddie Guerrero won the title a decade prior. Yes, it was the feel-good moment fans had dreamed for. And that wasn't the end of the big moments for the weekend either, because the next night on Raw, after the new WWE World Heavyweight Champion had come out to a hero's response earlier in the night, Paige made her main roster debut by defeating AJ Lee to become the new Divas Champion, and it was also on this Raw that the Ultimate Warrior would make his final on-screen appearance, as he would tragically pass away the following day. And that would lead us into the next pay-per-view of the year, May 4th's Extreme Rules, as there, after relinquishing her NXT Women's title, the Norwich native made her first big defense against Tamina Snuka. But that wasn't the big story of this show, because after Triple H decided to reform Evolution with Batista and Randy Orton in order to take out the now babyface Shield, all 6 men went to war in a show-stealing tag match. Of course, come the end of that one, it was the Hounds of Justice standing tall, and someone else who was standing tall was Bray Wyatt, because in his steel cage rematch with John Cena, he'd get the win. Then, in the main event, Daniel Bryan successfully defended the WWE World Heavyweight title against Kane. That said, bigger problems were on the horizon for the American Dragon, because as a result of a nagging shoulder injury, he'd have to sit the next month out as he tried his best to heal up. And this meant that at June 1st's Payback, just 3 days after NXT TakeOver saw Charlotte Flair defeat Natalya to become the brand's new women's champion, and Adrian Neville successfully defend his own belt against Tyson Kidd, the main event of the night would be the final showdown between The Shield and Evolution. Yes, this time it was a no-holds-barred elimination match, something Triple H thought would give his team the advantage. Unfortunately for the game though, by the end of this one it was a clean sweep for the babyfaces as they all stood tall. Elsewhere on the card meanwhile, Bray Wyatt lost to John Cena for a second time, but for as much as this upset many fans, they'd have bigger things to focus on the next night on Raw, when in a shock move, Seth Rollins turned on his Shield brothers and joined forces with the Authority. So with the Architect instantly becoming the most hated man in the company as a result of this, it was left to Dean Ambrose to seek revenge against him, as Roman Reigns instead segued into a program with Randy Orton. But the latter two wouldn't have their singles bout quite yet, because after Daniel Bryan's continued injury meant he was forced to vacate the WWE World Heavyweight title on the June 9th episode of Raw, it led to one of the upcoming Money in the Bank ladder matches at June 29th's titular pay-per-view now being for the belts themselves. Before that took place though, the undercard saw numerous successful title defenses when the Usos beat the Wyatt family and Paige defeated Naomi. Then, in the first Money in the Bank ladder match of the night, the Authority's new Golden Boy Seth Rollins outlasted Dolph Ziggler, Jack Swagger, Kofi Kingston, Rob Van Dam, and Dean Ambrose to win a title shot at a time of his choosing. That said, he wouldn't be the man on top come the end of the night though, because that honor went to John Cena instead when he beat Alberto Del Rio, Bray Wyatt, Kane, Randy Orton, Sheamus, Cesaro, and Roman Reigns to become the 15-time world champ. And when Rollins tried to cash in the next night on Raw in order to win this title, he'd be foiled by the Lunatic Fringe, as he from there vowed to never let his former Shield brother use the briefcase. So, needing to execute Plan C if they wanted to get the belt off Big Match John then, Triple H brought in a mercenary in the form of Brock Lesnar, someone who hadn't been seen since breaking The Undertaker's streak at WrestleMania. Of course, following such a feat, the Beast was fully established as the final boss of wrestling going forward. But while this left fans to wonder just how the SummerSlam main event would go once the two faced off in August, they'd still have to wait a while for that yet, because first, on July 20th, Battleground took place in Tampa, Florida. And on this show, it would all be about the belts again, as well. A recently returned AJ Lee was defending the Divas title she regained from Paige a few weeks prior. Elsewhere, The Miz was winning a battle royal to crown a new Intercontinental Champion, and John Cena was successfully walking out of a fatal four-way match against Randy Orton, Kane, and Roman Reigns, with the belt still around his waist. So that would lead us right into SummerSlam on August 17th, where, in the opening two bouts of the night, the Intercontinental and Divas titles both changed hands when Dolph Ziggler and Paige beat The Miz and AJ Lee, respectively. And once this was over, the excitement continued as after Rusev continued his rise up the card with a win over Jack Swagger, and Bray Wyatt regained some credibility by beating Chris Jericho, Seth Rollins and Dean Ambrose finally got to go one-on-one, with this round ultimately going to the Architect. Luckily for Dean's buddy Roman Reigns though, he'd have a much better time of things, because in his first ever pay-per-view singles match, he'd get a victory over Randy Orton. But that was all table setting for the main event, because there, one of the most one-sided main event squash matches in wrestling history took place when Brock Lesnar absolutely buried John Cena. Seriously, it's impossible to overstate just how brutal and shocking this was to see when it happened, because over the course of 16 minutes, Brock delivered 16 suplexes to the champ and left him barely able to get a lick of offense in. So needless to say, once it was over, there was a new WWE World Heavyweight Champion, with this being news which delighted the Authority. Not that Cena was done yet though. No, quite the opposite in fact, because after executing his rematch clause, he'd book himself a rematch at September 21st's Night of Champions pay-per-view. Before we'd get there though, NXT had another big show when TakeOver Fatal 4-Way saw Charlotte defeat Bayley in a women's title match, and Adrian Neville defend the brand's world title against Tyson Kidd, Tyler Breeze, and Sami Zayn. That said, for as dominating as Neville was over on the black and gold brand, he was nothing compared to what Brock Lesnar was doing on the main roster, because when the time came for his match against Cena, he not only retained via disqualification, but afterwards, he'd disappear for the rest of the year, effectively taking the belt hostage with him in the process. Yes, as the part-time champion, the Beast did whatever. So, in his absence, it was left to the other belts to pick up the slack, as with AJ Lee and The Miz once again winning the Divas and Intercontinental titles respectively at Night of Champions, they became the de facto top champs of the company. Of course, had Roman Reigns still been around at this point, it may very well have been him who was going after the IC strap next, but unfortunately, a hernia picked up while training around then had put the big dog out of action and forced him to take some time away. And while this was a big blow for WWE considering he was primed to serve as the company's next top star, the hope was that with enough rest and recovery, he'd be back in time for the Royal Rumble in January. That said, in his absence, someone would have to take the ball and run with it in the meantime. So it's lucky then that there were two people sitting patiently in the wings, just waiting for their chance to go all the way to the main event. Yes, at Hell in a Cell on October 26th, in lieu of Brock or Roman being there, WWE decided that Dean Ambrose and Seth Rollins would blow off their feud by going last inside of the cage. But while this was indeed a big opportunity for the new generation, and they certainly proved their worth with a great match, in the end, the whole thing would be hampered by an ending which saw the Lunatic Fringe lose after being distracted by a strange Bray Wyatt hologram. That's right, by now Bray Wyatt was seemingly losing a little bit of his luster. And also on this show, we saw the showdown between Brie and Nikki Bella, and a big-time match pitting John Cena against Randy Orton. And following this, WWE decided to shake things up a little when at November 23rd's Survivor Series, they'd book a massive 5-on-5 traditional elimination match in which, if John Cena's team of him, Dolph Ziggler, The Big Show, Ryback, and Eric Rowan could beat the Authority's team of Seth Rollins, Kane, Rusev, Mark Henry, and Luke Harper, then the heel unit would be forced to disappear from TV forever. But having no desire to disband, the Authority ended up throwing many roadblocks in the babyface's path during the 43-minute runtime of this one. Hell, at one point, after the Big Show completed his traditional turn of the month, it was left to Dolph Ziggler to fight Rollins, Kane, and Harper alone. Of course, while things may have looked dire here, there was someone waiting in the wings to save the day, and that was none other than Sting! Yes, it was at the close of this one when Steve Borden finally made his long-awaited WWE debut by coming out to fend off Triple H. And once he was done with that, he'd even helped the show off to get the pin over the Architect for the win. So with Team Cena coming out the victors, it meant the next night on Raw, the Authority would be forced to say their goodbyes. But even if they were gone, it wasn't the end of the year for WWE yet, because after NXT TakeOver R Evolution on December 11th saw not only the crowning of Sami Zayn as the Black and Gold brand's new champion, but also the debut and immediate heel turn of Kevin Owens, it was onwards to Cleveland, Ohio for TLC, Tables, Ladders, and Chairs just 3 days later. And here, with the Authority no longer being a factor, it meant the babyfaces got to have some shine again when Dolph Ziggler won the Intercontinental title from Luke Harper in an excellent ladder match. The Usos beat The Miz and his personal stunt double Damian Mizdow for the tag team titles, and John Cena defeated Seth Rollins in order to become #1 contender to Brock Lesnar's WWE World Heavyweight title. But that wasn't all which was happening here, because elsewhere, the recently formed New Day got their first spot on pay-per-view when two of their members, Big E and Kofi Kingston, got the better of the Rhodes brothers, and Rusev reigned tall as the United States champion following a victory over Jack Swagger. As well as this, we saw a stairs match between The Big Show and Eric Rowan, Nikki Bella defended her Divas title against AJ Lee, and Dean Ambrose versus Bray Wyatt. And only a couple of weeks later on the December 29th episode of Raw, the year closed when the Authority got their way back into power and set about putting their own guy, Seth Rollins, back on top. Yes, it was a wild year of ups and downs, with it marking the climax of the Yes Movement, the breakup of The Shield, the end of the streak, and the exit of CM Punk. But it would be until 2015 that we truly saw the rise of the Big Dog, a man who would become the face of the company for the next decade.